Hi, everyone. Just wanted you all to know that this episode of the Modern Digital Enterprise was recorded in February of this year. And then the pandemic hit, and we focused on COVID-19 related materials. Just in case you're wondering why we all seem so happy and full of joie de vivre, as if we hadn't a care in the world. Welcome to the Modern Digital Enterprise, everybody. Your digital transformation podcast from Anexinet. I'm your host, Steve Brickman, and we have something of a strategist forum lined up today. We're going to be talking about COE, Centers of Excellence. With me today, we have my co-host, Glenn Gruber, Senior Digital Strategist, and Senior Digital Strategist, Nitin Bhatia. Wait, are you a senior? I forget.
Whatever you want to call me.
I don't know.
He's an uber digital strategist right now. Above senior.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And we have a special guest, VP of Digital Solutions for Anexinet, Steve Tranchida.
Okay, glad to be here.
And so this is going to be really like just a general overview of Centers of Excellence, what they are, how they help, why you need one, and what Anexinet does to help you create yours. All right, so who wants to start it out? Let's just start it out. Wait, go ahead.
I'll just start it. Like, one of the reasons that I thought this could be a good podcast is that a publication kind of reached out about writing an article on the subject, like, are COEs still a thing? And I'm like, oh, this would be a good topic for us to talk about here. The other thing that was kind of interesting is that before we had this call, like, I also posed it to the Emerging Technology Council, in our Slack channel there. And for all of you who are listening who are not aware, Anexinet, along with Lopez Research, run something called the Emerging Technology Council, where different Fortune 500, IT and business leaders kind of talk about how do we onboard new technologies or face other challenges during digital transformation and kind of share those amongst each other. So, I went to that community, which is over 350 people strong. So please join. And I kind of asked, like, what did people think, just to try and take the temperature of the room, as it were. I got a couple of different responses. Like, there were some people who are like, I've had them in the past and they've been really valuable to onboard new technologies into the company. And then I also had someone else who said that every time she hears the word Centers of Excellence, she cringes and dies a little inside. So there's clearly very different perspectives on it. So that made me think that's an even better topic of conversation for us.
Yeah, that seems like a bit of an extreme reaction.
Not really.
Like, does she have children? I mean, you want to die a little inside. I mean, having children seems to be the most effective way that I've found to do that. I mean, opening a COE seems kind of benign compared to the various methods of torture that I succumb to every day. Nitin, you're now familiar.
Yeah, a little bit.
That?
Just a little bit. But Center of Excellence have existed for, I think, almost 2 decades, if not more. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is, what change are we trying to drive within the organization? And how do we bring together the different bodies across the organization to be able to drive that change? And as we all know it, and through our past experiences with a lot of customers, change is not easy. A lot of people and us humans don't like change, right? So some of the Center of Excellences come together naturally, come together through a particular methodology, but some of it clicks naturally. And that's because of the culture of the organization, the appetite for change, and what's driving the need for that change, more importantly. And then there are other organizations that set up Center of Excellences more as police to basically impede progress, as people might see it. The approach that different in terms of how that Center of Excellence is set up, what its ultimate goal is and what its purpose is within the organization, who is involved in it, the different bodies, the representation across the organization, and kind of understanding ultimately what are we trying to change. If there isn't necessarily a need for that change, then we should just take it in the back and shoot it. That's kind of the way I would put it. So that's why there's a varying degree of emotion involved with Center of Excellence. And ultimately, I think it's just the verbiage. Like people start to think of centers of excellence as kind of a dictatorial kind of way of pushing down change or driving change within the organization, when that shouldn't necessarily be the case.
Let's just back up a little bit. Let's start from a very fundamental level. Whoever wants to just define what a center of excellence is, just for those who are not familiar.
Yeah, this should be fun.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental issue that centers of excellence are attempting to solve are the fact that you don't want to solve the same problem over and over again in different areas of the business, or do things completely different ways across a business, especially a large company. And so there needs to be some body of knowledge, some discoverable, reusable body of knowledge, samples, situational best practices, where people in an organization can go to reuse and learn, really. And that's a fundamental need that's really never going to go away. The term COE has evolved around that need, and it's been done, as we've talked about, in a few different ways, some good and some not so good. And the not so good ones have really led to kind of this stigma around COEs. I'm going to roll my eyes, and it's just an ivory tower organization that's going to slow down. To COEs, oh, cool, I want to be part of that because I want to help set the standards and best practices. And there are all of those extremes, but fundamentally it's intended to be a reusable knowledge and discoverable base of best practices around a particular domain. Could be a technical domain, could be a business domain. How'd I do?
That's great. What prompted their invention in the first place?
Well, I think Steve touched on a couple of those, which is something that we have seen a lot of times when we go into an organization. When someone's talking about a new technology, you often find that there's 3 or 4 or 10 pockets of people who have interest in that technology. And a lot of times those 3 or 4 or 10 groups kind of go and do their own thing, and they try and solve it in their own way. And so the challenge is, we used to kind of refer to this as the Wild West, of mobile or whatever technology that it is, that you've got a lot of higher costs in the organization of approaching it in that kind of fractured manner, from the simplest higher cost of, well, those different groups may have bought all sorts of different platforms and tools to get the job done at that time, and therefore I'm paying 3 or 4 or more vendors money to basically do the same thing. There's the cost of those groups succeeding at different levels, in some cases based on their own expertise and ability, other cases based on limitations of maybe some of those platforms that they bought. So we're not getting as much out of it. But then as we try and spread these technologies throughout the organization, you've got fracturing of process, and who are the people who know how to do this as we try and scale that technology throughout the company. And this repeats every time that there's a new technology of interest. A lot of times these COEs look to get formed to try and make the organizations a little bit more efficient in terms of how they understand, onboard, and scale that technology.
So how large is like the average COE? Is it like 5 people, 10 people?
That gets a lot to the design of how you want to approach it. Nitin was talking about that before, where you've got certain COEs are based on let's create, and Steve mentioned this too, let's create a repository of knowledge that at least everyone's kind of singing off the same song sheet. Other times you've got ones that are just focused around building a group of folks who are like your internal consultants, to advise different teams throughout the organization. How would I go about implementing this technology or building this application? And then there are the ones that are end up trying to become a technology factory of, send me all your projects, I'll do the work for you, and I'm going to build a large team. So depending on which of those methods or which combination of those methods that you try and build, you'll have different size teams. Like I've totally seen it where when there's interest in going down the factory route, you can have dozens, even hundreds of people in that organization. Yeah, but if it's more the advisory style role, then it's much, much leaner.
Yeah, it's a great point, Glenn. I mean, if a COE ends up becoming more like a product development team of shared components, it can get very large, and it can also start to get into a lot of the headwinds that give it a little bit of the stigma. Like, you're mandating use of certain components, you have multiple consumers consuming your output, and therefore you have to support them all. And so you have to be very careful about upgrading and doing new releases. And so a lot of those challenges start to pop up. So, it depends on really the COE's goal. Is it to really be a factory producing product output, or is it really going to stay at the best practices, prescription, knowledge level?
To think of a COE as this fixed thing, like you start one way and that's the way it's going to be, would be fundamentally incorrect. So when you start the COE, your purpose and your goal may be X, but as you start to go down a certain path, and you're assessing your organization's change for appetite, and you're assessing some of the other gaps that you have, I think that COE will morph into something. So when we sort of talk about COE to our customers, we say, you need to get at least the core team in place who are your champions, who are going to drive a lot of this COE, who own the COE, so that just does not die this natural death due to the lack of ownership. But those champions then bring in other disciplines into the COE as they're starting to see gaps, or they're starting to see opportunities, as they're starting to see, our purpose is now gone from X to Y, and that COE should morph. And that to me would be a successful COE, because you're adapting to how your organization is reacting through the change that you're trying to push through the organization.
Yeah, a lot of that, how that evolves, is related to company culture. And there are always going to be some folks who they want to run the COE and build a large team. Like that can be their mindset. So they try and go in a certain path, but many times you'll end up recreating a lot of elements or roles that exist elsewhere in the organization that are very highly functioning. So many of the client engagements that I've been a part of, we try and think of a federated approach to the COE, where yes, for whatever the core technology is, the folks who have the expertise in that area or are going to build that expertise, that's their responsibility. But you need to think about either network infrastructure or security or other governance structures or integration and APIs. Don't recreate that within the organization. Partner with all of those other folks and those other teams, and make them part of the COE, but in that federated manner. I believe that that's been far more successful, and it helps if you're trying to establish a foundation for this technology and you want to spread that and scale that through the organization. By being able to partner and take advantage of what's already there, makes you ramp the capabilities of that COE faster, but also reduces a lot of the backlash or friction that you might see if you're trying to basically step into other folks' territory or what they believe to be their territory.
So where does Anexinet come in? What services do we offer around COEs for our clients?
The mobile COE is a really good example.
Fundamentally, what we try and come in and do is understand the organization, understand the goals for the COE. And when I talk about understanding the organization, I also mean try to understand the context of how have they tried to do this before, whether successfully or not successfully. Understand how the organization functions, what the culture of that organization is, so that we can build something or recommend and design something that will succeed. Because we're not coming in and saying, here's the model of our COE, here's the cookie cutter, and off we go, just follow the paint by numbers diagram that we give you and you're all set. So like everything, we're coming in a very consultative manner to try and build a structure that's going to both succeed, but also grow and hit the goals. And I think another thing that we try and talk about is how do we structure from a governance perspective? How do we communicate not only what the objective of this team is going to be, but what it's responsible for and how to engage it? That's another part where I think that we fundamentally seen some challenges, and when other COEs have been attempted to get to be started, is that no one quite really knows what it is or how to work with it, and therefore it gets a little bit left to the side and doesn't get the kind of adoption and impact that was originally hoped.
Yeah, some good points there, Glenn, in that, some clients come to us and say, hey, we have a new technology that we're trying to take advantage of, and we want to start a COE around it. Help us start that. And we do have some good experience around that. But other times, a client may be in the middle of this exercise already, trying to stand up a COE and struggling with certain aspects of it, specific aspects of it. So I'll give you a couple examples. Earlier this week, I talked to a client who was responsible for a COE, and we asked them, what's the biggest thing you're struggling with? And they said adoption. If somebody creates a standard and nobody hears it or nobody can find it, did it really happen? That sounds familiar. But the key thing there is their challenge was, how do they drive adoption of the COE across the organization? And there's a bunch of recipes around that in terms of how do you publish work, how do you make it discoverable, how do you almost, I'll say, market it, the good work that's being done in the COE with regular communications and updates on what the COE is doing, because all of that drives adoption across the organization and kind of breaks down the stigmas of the COE is there to mandate things as opposed to the COE is there to make my life easier. So adoption is one area where we see struggles. Another is specific content in the COE. Hey, one of the pieces of my COE is to drive some security standards, and I'm struggling with certain domain pieces of that technically, and oftentimes we can help them over the hump in those areas too. So it really depends on the entry point where the customer is.
So you mentioned a company that developed a COE for a specific new technology that they were adopting. I'm wondering, how many COEs does a company need now that mobile and digital are just sort of variations of the same coin these days? Mobile is so much more ingrained in our business processes than it was a few years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. So is it still necessary for a company to have, say, a separate mobile COE and a digital COE, or individual COEs for different technologies within the company?
Yeah, I mean, some of that comes down to all the way back to, taxonomy. Like, how do I divide up the domains of expertise that I need in my company? And is there a big enough difference in the domain of knowledge around mobile compared to the domain of knowledge around digital development in general? Is there a big enough difference that those are two distinct things? That's really the question. And I don't know that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, but what we would look at are things like, okay, well, if we're talking about mobile, what very unique challenges, what very unique things exist in that domain that someone, say, doing a web development or services integration development wouldn't be thinking about? For example, how to take advantage of the unique capabilities of mobile devices, how to manage and maintain the devices themselves, how to secure them with all their unique challenges. So is there a critical mass of differentiation in the domain areas? And again, some of it is just organization and taxonomy around whether you have one or two, but I think that's a key thing to look at.
Yeah, that definitely is key. And then also making sure that the goals align. So if there are fundamentally different goals. So for example, if as an organization, we have been using a different way to deliver solutions to our end customers, let's say, we're waterfallish or some variant of that, we want to adopt the agile across the organization, not just for IT, but just fundamentally across the organization in terms of how we capture demand, how the demand gets approved, how do we budget and finance for that particular demand initiative, and then taking that through the development, implementation, and support. If you're driving agile and your goal is to be able to adopt agile, and you're less so concerned about whether this is a mobile technology or digital or cloud technology or infrastructure or anything as such, then your COE is aligned around achieving the agile processes, achieving some of the pure tenets of being able to react to change within the organization. Versus, if you're specifically, let's say you have a good digital footprint and you're particularly, struggling with mobile, then you'd go build a mobile COE because that's kind of where you want to hone in. And those are the challenges and the struggles that you want to come together and be able to get through. And then there are practice level. Like, for example, earlier on in my career was a part of a revenue cycle center of excellence, which was a end-to-end, sort of building a solution right from, when hospitals are making claims all the way up to when that claim gets paid. And this included anything and everything from building the right processes, building the right documentation, building the right platform to be able to track that and provide the information to the different stakeholders within the process. So it just varies, as Steve was pointing out.
Yeah, and the other thing that I'll add is, a lot of times the goal is to instantiate something brand new, right? That's a lot of times that people want to bring in a COE is to accommodate. Like Nitin was just talking about, I want to make agile the way that we run development projects as opposed to waterfall. So you go around, you start maybe a center of excellence to instantiate that within the organization. But over time, once that technology becomes mature or the organization has really internalized that technology or that process, the need for that COE lessens. And at some point, many times, you'll sunset it because it's not really providing that initial value anymore. So over the course of time, we may see many COEs within the organization, but they're not installed and then become part of, fossilized into the structure of the organization forever and ever and ever. So you may see that 5 years ago, we had a mobile COE. This year, maybe it's going to be around machine learning or something else. I don't think we should be focused on how many of these that there ought to be, or that it's really how many do we need in order to either adopt new technologies or processes, until we get to a level of maturity where we're able to scale that and everyone kind of knows how it goes.
Is that more the typical life cycle that the COE is kind of a living organism that changes expertise and sort of experts come and go as needed?
So yes, it is definitely a living, breathing organism. If you are constantly shifting the fundamental goal of a COE, then there's something to be brought to the table with regards to, are we even looking at the right thing or going after the right thing? But, as long as the fundamental purpose stays intact, our approach and, the people that we're involving from an organization perspective, the expertise and the discipline and the deliverables that come out of it are sort of fluctuating, I think that's okay. But just like any other organism, it's going to have its infancy, it's going to, have its surge, it's going to plateau out, and then at some point, as Glenn pointed out, we do need to sort of sunset it so that this is, a sign of maturity, right? It's almost a sign of celebration that we have achieved our end goal, and now we're getting to a point to where there's not necessarily a need for this particular element in the organization to drive this change.
And are they also responsible for creating documentation as well, guidelines, so things get left behind when emphasis is less on a certain technology or a certain process, so that historically somebody can go back and refer to these things? Is that part of the responsibility?
Yeah. As a part of, building a COE, hopefully you're building a lot of the documentation, you're building a lot of the processes, and like Steve was pointing out, you're making those available for those outside the COE to consume. I mean, that would be the fundamental benefit to bringing, a discipline under a single umbrella, publishing a lot of the guidance, the governance, the templates, the best practices, and then making those available and continuing to, sort of groom them over time as you get, more learnings, as you get better and better as an organization. And that should continue to live, even past perhaps the deprecation of a COE.
Steve, you mentioned offline that one of the biggest issues with COEs, I guess it's really like an adoption issue, is just the difficulty that we might have proving like an ROI, and that a COE will provide financial benefits that make it worth establishing. Can you talk to that a little bit?
And that's a tough one. ROI from the cost of the COE itself compared to not having it and dealing with the things, compared to the reasons you spun up the COE in the first place, which is to get reuse, to make life easier, to make businesses produce output faster. So that's the trade-off is, we form a COE so that we're not reinventing the wheel across different areas of the organization. And theoretically, if we're doing that right, you're getting a multiplicative factor of savings. So I develop something once in a COE, and 5, 10, 20 different times over the course of a year, that gets reused across the organization, saving a bunch of time. It is tricky to be able to measure that and report on it. I think in general, organizations will have kind of a critical mass sense of, is the COE truly providing a lot of value, or is it slowing me down? And I think that's kind of the litmus test, if you will. And some organizations go really far in terms of trying to measure that and even do chargebacks to the COE when things are being reused. But overall, I think it's really important to take a hard look at the COE and say, is this making it easier, faster, better, cheaper for the organization to achieve its business goals? That's the litmus test. Am I achieving my business goals faster, cheaper, more efficiently, and with more quality by the use of the COE? And if not, we need to ask why not. Is it an adoption issue? Is it a quality issue? Is the COE not moving fast enough to keep up with the demands of the business? Those are all things that can be looked at.
And I'll add that, obviously every organization is going to be different, but many times you're not going to get people to just build a COE because I think that, hey, this is an interesting technology and we should understand it. So let's go build a COE. Sometimes there's a specific initiative or project that is driving the need for a certain technology, perhaps. And at that time, that's maybe when you'll create the COE to first help stand up that first project, but now it can scale and do other things with other segments of the business. Some organizations talk about that, first project through pays, essentially. That's sometimes done with software platforms, not just COEs, but there's usually an impetus behind saying that we need to really invest in this technology rather than maybe just doing some early POCs to start to investigate whether this technology may apply. So there's usually a tipping point related to a project that's got its own ROI that can help support the initiation of the COE.
Hey, we just did something cool as part of solving this business problem. Let's share this out and let other people take advantage of it. That organic way of doing things, I think, happens a lot, and it's a good way to show the initial ROI with the initial project. Good point.
Is that where our COE Kickstart provides the most benefit, do you think? Is that where it's most suited, for companies like introducing a new technology, or is that a oversimplification?
I wouldn't necessarily, like I said, like COEs can be of any different flavors. So just tying it to a specific technology, like, going back to the Agile example, the whole reason you even came to the conclusion that we want to have a, Agile COE is because you have identified, or at least you think you've identified, some inefficiencies within the organization. Typically when customers engages, those are one of the first few conversations, like, why are we going down this path? Like, what are the inefficiencies? What are some of the business drivers that you're trying to impact? Like, and trying to get those in some level of measurable sense to say, okay, once we do put the COE in place, then can we constantly keep measuring up against that to see, are we driving change? And not all of those metrics or measures are going to be financially beneficial to the company. Sometimes you're hitting the bottom line. Like we're more efficient. Like our finances turning around our budgets and our funding for our projects much faster, so we can react to the market much quickly. Right? That has nothing to do with development or implementation or anything. It's just finance would take forever to do that. So you have to kind of think of it as a more holistic thing than just trying to think of it as in just one piece or one segment. And ROI may not always necessarily turn into dollars, but ROI can always turn into the organization achieving some level of competitive advantage, some level of efficiency, some level of customer satisfaction, as long as those are some of the goals that we've identified for our Center of Excellence. I think one of the things that I will also put to that laundry list is a kind of completely generalized and watered down COE. If your COE does not have specific goals, or the goals are so broad that we're just going to touch anything and everything that sounds like technology, that will tend to fail, and it wouldn't necessarily get the adoption or the traction. Our purpose of going within the organization to attempt to make change is to be able to start small. That's key to be able to introduce change within the organization. You want to start small, you want to grow from there, you want to be able to gather feedback and then be able to tweak your approach, pivot if you need to, and continue to progress. If your COE gets so large to where by the time you gather feedback or understood how your organization is reacting, or maybe not even reacting to it, you spend millions and millions of dollars and really not achieved anything. So that would be one other thing that I would add to that list.
So I think we touched on one reason why COEs tend to fail or get a bad rep if they act as an enforcement arm, or if they're seen as a governing body or an ivory tower as being a bad thing. But are there any other reasons why a COE might fail in terms of something that Anexinet can come in and help clients prevent?
In terms of helping people make successful COEs, a lot of what I believe we bring to the table is just experience. We've worked with so many different customers across a number of different domains that we have the benefit of perspective. I would say, like, a lot of times people talk about best practices, and I've said for a long time that best practices is only the best practice that I've seen in my career. So, so a best practice at company A versus at company B can be very different, or achieve different levels of success. So I think that's some of the perspective of what we've seen work. I think that there are overlooked aspects as to why things are successful. Steve touched on it, Nitin touched on it as well, in terms of just the communication strategy. How do we let people know what we can do, how we can help them in real terms, and how to properly engage with us so that everyone gets the most out of it? There a lot of times it's, if we build it, they will come. But if you're not actively marketing it especially with support from, executive leadership behind it, then it won't take off and you won't gain the benefits. Even if everything else around how we've designed the COE is right, it still doesn't necessarily be successful. So that communications plan step is often overlooked, but can often be very critical to success too.
Amen to that, because I cannot emphasize how much change management is kind of the underlying component of a successful COE. The whole communication aspect of it, setting the right expectations, making sure you're managing those expectations, you're communicating, you're capturing feedback, you're reacting to the feedback, is all important parts of the tone that the Center of Excellence sets. And that tone drives whether I want to accept change from this body, or do I not want to accept change from this body. And I think that it is a really, really crucial part. So yeah, the whole change management aspect of it is pivotal to the success of a center of excellence.
Yeah, and that's the whole culture eats strategy for breakfast thing.
Absolutely.
And another part of it is also just understanding like how to choose the right individual to lead that COE, because there's an evangelism part of this and an understanding of how to build relationships and work with different parts of the business, both on the IT side as well as the business side, that if you get that wrong, if that person doesn't know how to reach out and build trust and build relationships, it also can be a major challenge in making that successful. And back maybe to your original point of what else does Anexinet do to help, is really giving it a kickstart. Like I know we talk about a lot of our strategy engagements are kickstarts, but there are times where as you're looking for that leadership, as you're trying to, you may have identified the structure of the COE organization, but you don't have those people on day one. So a lot of times what we'll do is not only help identify, what's the operating plan, what's the model, what are the services that the COE provides, but as the company is going through the hiring process of filling those roles, we can step in, take those roles, get some early wins and progress going, and then allow the organization to kind of backfill and step in and then really assume ownership. But this way you're not waiting, 3, 6, however many months to put that infrastructure in place before you can get going on something that you've clearly identified is important to the organization, or I wouldn't be making this investment both in the design and then the execution of the COE in the first place.
Yeah, all good points. And I like to view a COE as a service organization in and of itself, right? As opposed to a enforcer, someone who sets and enforces best practices. They're providing a service to the organization, and the mentality should be that way. The leader of the COE should exude that mentality, right down to saying, hey, we're not always going to be the sharpest person in the room. Sometimes somebody close to the business building a solution may come up with something that we haven't thought of. And we need to have a very open and clear way to ingest that back into the COE when someone outside of the core COE has done great work, and quickly take a look at that and incorporate it in, forcing that feedback cycle and agility of the COE to consistently evolve and to consistently reach out across the organization and incorporate the best ideas from the organization over time. That comes back to process. It comes back to the leader of the COE, and it comes back to the mentality that I'm a service organization to the company within this COE, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to tell you how to do it and you're going to do it my way. It's a very different mental model.
Do you have any good success stories where a client has adopted a COE and then like immediately seen some drastic improvement?
We just did a COE engagement recently with Edward Jones, and they've built a team, and they're still super lean. There's really only a couple of people focused on mobile, this one specifically. And we've helped them build the structure around that and get approval for it within the company. And we've helped them along the way as they're building that out. It's kind of I discussed earlier, where we've done the first couple of prototypes with them, and they've kind of seen how we run the process, and hopefully that's a way where they can internalize that and take it forward. And I think that will extend to once they look to move into development of some of those apps that we just prototyped, which I believe is coming. Another really good example is one where we provided they already had some of it in place. And this was actually, I think, my first engagements was with Amerisource Bergen. So they had the intent, they had a couple of people identified, but we helped them kind of flesh out what that structure was, as well as going through the whole IT readiness and building out a roadmap of all the things that team needed to do. A year later, we went back to do what was sort of like a health check, and they grew the organization more than maybe most other clients. They went and they completed almost everything on the IT maturity roadmap that we gave them, they made tremendous progress. They were ETC members as well. And one of the first that I knew that had started to build like Alexa skills, like they started in mobile and they did some good mobile things, but then they extended into other technologies, became a little bit more of like an innovation hub than simply mobile. But that was very successful.
I was just thinking, wanted to sort of get us into our predictive segment of the podcast here, where we talk about what the future of COEs and so forth. And I was thinking that machine learning is probably a big area that COEs will have to command. But then I was thinking that the way that a machine learning data set can have bias, I'm wondering if a COE also can exhibit bias, if that's a serious issue. And you kind of talked about it a little bit, just mentioning that the leadership of a COE is important, but how often does bias play a role?
Yeah, well, it's made up of humans, right? So in that sense, there's always going to be bias. And frankly, there are always going to be situations where there's a couple of different good ways to do something. And so the bias of one person will say, I want to do it, with technique X, and the bias of another person will say, I want to do it with technique Y, and both of them will get you to a result. And so it's not about making the organization do it my way. It's about bringing value to the organization by being the steward of the best practices and being the caretaker of the organization's best practices.
So where do you see COEs going in the future? Do you see them just becoming more critical to an organization as technology evolves? What's been the trend?
Look, I mean, there's always going to be the need for the fundamental things we talked about when we started this podcast, with reuse and not reinventing the wheel. That need is never going to go away. So the term COE may evolve. In the agile and scaled agile community, there's a lot of talk about building community of practice, and the idea of building sort of an agile steward of best ways to practice a certain domain of knowledge. So terminology may change, techniques will evolve, more agility will be injected into COEs, but the fundamental need that these bodies solve within an organization, I think, is always going to exist, and the way technology is moving probably will accelerate.
I agree with Steve on that. There's always something coming down the road. Like every time you think that, there can be not anything new under the sun, there's something that's not just new, but game changing that comes along. Machine learning, AR, VR, like there's just, I don't know how many examples. And that's just what we know about today. There's more stuff coming. I will ask though, sort of dad joke time, but, is a machine learning COE really like a living, breathing organism? Like at that point, isn't the whole idea to get humans out of the whole thing?
That's what I'm wondering. Can we actually just replace it with machine learning?
Oh, eventually, especially if people aren't going door to door to work with other folks in the organization. It can just be like chatbots.
Yeah,
everywhere.
They'll never know. They'll just think they're people.
Is this a machine learning podcast? Are you guys real?
This is.
I don't know. Well, I think that pretty much covered everything. I know that we've written some white papers about COEs, and I'm sure there's been a webinar, so I will be sure to include links to those in the podcast notes on our website. What else? Glenn, do you want to promote the ETC some more?
Yeah, at the ETC, we sometimes talk about COEs, but really more the focus is on new technologies, trying to understand possible use cases. How can we apply them to the organization, and really shared learning across the different members of what they've done. If you're interested in learning about any of these new technologies, or just learning about how other folks have what they've tried in some of these areas and what succeeded and what hasn't gone quite so well, and you want to take advantage of the benefit of the mistakes that they've made, come and join. And we'll put a link in the show notes to that as well.
That's great. All right. Steve, Nitin, Glenn, thanks so much for joining me today. That was great.
Yeah, it was fun.
I'm sad that you couldn't come up with a chicken analogy. It's weird to do a chicken-free podcast, but
I know. Well, the only thing I could really think of is that with chickens, one of the funny things about them is that when one chicken starts doing something, all the other chickens start doing it, as if like, oh, hey, that's a great idea. Let's start preening, and then they'll all preen for 10 minutes, or one of them will like, oh, sunbathe, like, oh yeah, sunbathing. I didn't think of that. That's fantastic, and then they'll all sunbathe. So there's some sort of like rotating sense of leadership that happens there, but that's the best I got.
It just means that you got to, from a change perspective, you got to just teach one. So your change cycle is fairly short.
That's right. They're very agile.
Yeah.
I got nothing.
Sorry, just a running gag, Steve. Well, thanks again, guys. And thank you for hopping on to another episode of the Modern Digital Enterprise, your digital transformation podcast from Anexinet. All right, goodbye.
see ya.
Thanks.
Bye.
As a leading technology consultancy and reseller, Anexinet helps clients provide a complete digital experience for customers, employees, and end users. We accomplish this through our holistic approach, which encompasses all aspects of today's digital journey, end to end. Anexinet partners with top technology vendors like HPE to offer products and services that enhance the digital experience across customer engagement, enterprise mobility, cloud and hybrid IT, and analytics. Because great digital experiences rely on the smooth operation of all interconnected elements. From strategy through execution, we deliver custom multi-channel applications, including web, mobile, chat, and voice. With self-service apps for customer loyalty and enterprise apps that streamline internal processes, now you can reimagine legacy applications to propel your business forward. Anexinet also helps you embrace modern cloud and hybrid IT infrastructure to provide a seamless experience at every touchpoint, empowering you to recover quickly from disaster, scale to meet demand, and automate systems for perfect performance 24/7. And to maximize your competitive advantage, we ensure you always deliver the best experience possible by continuously honing your digital solutions through data-driven insights. So, how do you know if your business has what it takes to provide the complete digital experience? One that sets you apart, maintains competitive edge, and turns users into passionate fans? Simple. Just give us a call. Together, we can deepen engagement and make every digital experience remarkable.